Hey everybody, P.D. Turner, executive producer and host of your Break It Down show. I've got an interesting one for you today. Joshua Philipp, who's an investigative journalist for the Epoch Times, comes and joins me to talk about his work investigating China, also what he thinks about the coronavirus, some origin stories and that kind of thing. This is a really interesting episode given the time right now, and we're looking at understanding how to survive the coronavirus. But what Joshua is doing is looking at the origins, the sources, and asking those hard investigative journalistic questions that are there. Now, sometimes this stuff's going to be a little bit hard to swallow. I know you can take it. But here's the thing about Josh. This is what he does for a living. He looks into these things, and when you start to put the pieces together, you end up with more questions than certainties. So this will be a challenging episode. I know you're going to enjoy it. I know you're going to enjoy Josh's work. You can find him work at the Epoch Times website. He's also on Twitter, so not hard to find Joshua and engage with him there. Okay. If you like the show, you like what we're doing, obviously we cover a lot of topics. We got some really exciting stuff coming up. Do support the show by subscribing, rating, reviewing, telling friends. These are all great things. If you share episodes that you find particularly interesting, these are really, really good ways to help support the show and get the word out there. Think about the things you normally post. Is it that big of a deal to help the show? I don't think so. That's what I'm going to ask of you. Try to share the show once this week. That would be really helpful. Hey, and if you're abroad, I see you. I see you listening. I see you digging the shows. I appreciate it. Even if you guys who listen don't do anything, I still appreciate you. And thank you so much. We're all trying to stick together and survive through this crazy pandemic time. Hopefully you all know that I care about you and look to do the same thing for each other. Care for one another, everybody. One last thing. Save the Brave. You know what I'm going to say. SaveTheBrave.org. Click on that donate tab, put a small amount of money in, and each month we will pull it out and put it to good use supporting veterans and trying to keep them around from the PTSD scourge that it is. All right, listen, everybody. Here comes Joshua. I think you're going to dig this one.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hey, this is Joshua Philipp, and welcome to the Break It Down show.
Yeah, Joshua's on the Break It Down show. I met him and Siamak. They're from the Epoch Times. And actually, you guys should go to YouTube and watch Crossroads, which is Joshua's show. He is an investigative journalist, and he covers China specifically. And I have a question already for you, Joshua, but I want to make sure we spend a moment talking a little bit about what Epoch Times is, just real briefly, so that those that haven't heard of it or have seen it but don't know much about it can get clued in. But then I want to get into the investigative journalistic side of it, and then finally get into the coronavirus part, which you've done a lot of work on. So just give us a basic primer on the Epoch Times and what it is that you guys are trying to do.
The Epoch Times was started in 2000 by Chinese Americans, and the reason they started it was originally actually for Chinese overseas, living outside of China, mainly because they saw an issue that there are no real media outside of China or inside China for that matter that aren't controlled or, let's say, controlled under pressure by the Chinese Communist Party. And so they saw a need for a media that could provide people with real, accurate, kind of fearless reporting when it came to China. And that came at a big cost. We actually had some reporters in China. They got a knock at the door one day. Police came in, arrested everyone. Our editor spent 10 years in prison. They tortured him. Actually, Amnesty International had a whole thing on him. We've been breaking stories on China from the get-go. We were the first ones to expose organ harvesting, there's this tribunal now in the UK which just verified it, came out with firsthand accounts of people, doctors being forced to harvest organs from living people. We were the first ones to report the SARS outbreak back in 2002, 2003, and the cover-up of it. You name it. We've been on the front lines of a lot of issues with China.
You said Amnesty International got involved because they arrested one of your guys' journalists or editors, but how is that even possible in this day and age that you can arrest someone from the press? I get it. They don't have freedom of the press, but it just seems impossible that could even happen.
Yeah, that was back in 2000, 2001-ish. And I mean, this is not unheard of in China. Just recently, the Chinese Communist Party, well, Hong Kong, arrested the editor of Apple Daily, which is one of the only other independent media for the Chinese communities. I should make it clear too. Epoch Times now, we're 23 countries. 17 languages, something like that.
Wow.
I mean, we're all over the place. English is our kind of main focus right now.
Uh-huh.
Basically, we saw a need for honest, traditional, just to the point journalism like it used to be, for not just the Chinese people, but for all, pretty much the whole world. So that's where we're at now.
Okay, and then you are an investigative journalist, and look, because of this time, it's easy to wonder about the credibility. It used to be investigative journalists were respected, and you guys are real hard line on your sources and everything else, and you wouldn't put stuff out that wasn't legitimate. Nowadays, I have to do a bona fides with you because there's so much pandering and nonsense. Give us an idea of like where you are with the investigative journalist thing, and then how did you even get into this line of work?
It was actually unintentional, and I mean, fully agreed with you on that too. Just real quick, journalism is a complete mess these days. There's so much special interest in journalism. There's so many people just playing the party politics, playing the special interests, playing the political views. I mean, I personally can't stand most journalism these days. And in my work, I hope to not be like those types of journalists who I don't particularly enjoy reading.
Yeah.
Maybe is a nice way to put it. But my kind of introduction, how I got started with investigative journalism was actually unintentional. Long story short, back in 2008, I had been reporting for Epoch Times as a freelancer between 2006 and 2008. 2008. I moved to New York for an internship because our main office is in New York. And I was assigned to go report on a series of incidents that were taking place in one of the biggest Chinese communities, which is Flushing, Queens. If you're in New York, you probably know Flushing. If you head to the end of the 7 train into Queens, like the very last stop is Flushing. And it's kind of like the new Chinatown. Okay. Chinatown, as a lot of people know, in Manhattan, kind of, it's not what it used to be. Flushing is the real Chinatown these days. And there were some serious, weird things going on in Flushing. Basically, there were crowds of like hundreds of people gathered on the streets, beating people up, spitting on them, threatening to kill them. I mean, you name it. I mean, shoving around old ladies, like threatening to kill their kids. I mean, crazy stuff, totally crazy stuff. I was like told, okay, go figure out what's going on, go report on it. Right. I'm like, great. That sounds like a good, kind of, as a new reporter, you stuff like this is interesting because
right.
you kind of want that adventure. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I go out there and I'm like trying to figure out what's going on. And people are like, oh, those guys are spies. Those guys are with the Chinese consulate. All kinds of stuff. And I'm sitting there like, I'd never encountered anything like this. They point to a guy and like, yeah, that's a spy from the Chinese consulate. It's this like sweaty dude in a wife beater who like doesn't look like he showers. And I'm like, and I mean, me, growing up on like James Bond movies, I'm like, yeah, that's not a spy. Come on, guys. Like,
where's this Aston Martin?
Yeah. I'm like, yeah, that's not a spy. That's just like, I'm surprised he actually has a home,
right.
Let alone like gets money from a foreign government. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Long story short, here's what was happening. There were targeted attacks against people who practiced Falun Gong, which is a Chinese spiritual practice. Epoch Times is one of the first media to really expose the persecution of Falun Gong. Part of the reason Epoch Times started, which I should have mentioned earlier, was because basically in 1999, the Chinese Communist Party launched a persecution against 70 million to 100 million people. These were people who practice. It's kind of like Tai Chi. You ever seen this before? Chinese people doing like slow movements in the park.
Right.
They call it Qigong. Falun Dafa or Falun Gong is a type of Qigong practice. And so it's kind of like this morning exercise people do. And it has a moral foundation in truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. Long story short, Falun Gong was the most popular Qigong practice in China. The Chinese Communist Party declared it was a threat to the atheistic rule of the Communist Party. The then leader of the party, Jiang Zemin, So, said find a reason to persecute it. They tried to think it was a cult. They couldn't find proof of that. They said not only is it not a cult, it's actually beneficial to the country. Jiang Zemin said, well, persecute it anyway. And so what they did was they manufactured fake news, propaganda, broadcasted it 24/7. All the Chinese media had this, nonstop, and all the Western media, because they had no other sources, just repeated what the Chinese Communist Party was saying. And so you had roughly 1 out of every 15 Chinese people targeted with, kidnapping, torture, re-education through labor, killing, you name it. And not only was the world not calling for an end to this or condemning it, but a lot of the world was actually supporting it or just turning a blind eye to it. Wow. And so Chinese Americans saw this and this is sickening. This is horrible. We need to find a way to tell people what's going on. And that was part of the reason why they started Epoch Times. But long story short, the Chinese Communist Party, I'd later discovered, and I'll get into that whole discovery process, was trying to find a way to somewhat export that persecution abroad. And so there were these large scale, at least that was the allegation at the time, which I did manage to verify. I'll get into that. But anyways, there were these large scale attacks in this Chinese community, and not just Flushing, but all Chinese communities. There's another Chinatown in Brooklyn and one in Manhattan. There were also attacks, but the largest were in Flushing. And they were attacking Falun Gong practitioners. They were attacking democracy activists, and they were attacking house Christians. It was bizarre, man. I wish I could illustrate it better with words, but it was really bizarre. In fact, you can still find some videos online of it, probably. I started noticing some weird patterns. Well, the first thing that really piqued my interest was that one, as I mentioned, but as I just now mentioned, it wasn't just in Flushing this was happening. This was happening in Chinatown in Manhattan, and this was happening in Chinatown in Brooklyn. And so I'm like, okay, this is something bigger. This wasn't just happening in Flushing, Queens. This is also happening in Manhattan, Chinatown. This is also happening in Brooklyn. But then something even crazier started happening, which is that these same attacks started happening in other countries. The same attack started happening in France. Same attack started happening in Taiwan. Started happening in Hong Kong. Started happening in all kinds of countries. Yeah, the same kind of attacks started happening in other parts of the world. And as soon as that starts happening, I'm like, okay, something coordinated is probably going on here. Maybe there is some truth to this whole, Chinese consulate behind it. Maybe there is some truth to this whole spy thing. And so I started looking for signs of that. And I noticed one thing that was interesting, which is that a lot of the groups launching these attacks had something in common. They had bullhorns, they had banners, they had shirts sometimes that had the names of different Chinese fraternal organizations on them, such as the Shandong Association, the Fujian American Association, the Peking Association, these types of things. And for a lot of people who don't know, this is actually pretty significant. It's one of the reasons why Chinatowns are so hard to understand from the outside. These associations are what are known as tongs. And the tongs are like the unofficial governing bodies of Chinatowns. Now, this kind of goes far back. Basically, traditional Chinese society, you didn't have government below the county level. Beneath the county level, you had kind of like a bottom-up social, grassroots government. And that was the family associations, that was the guilds, hometown associations, those kinds of things, the tongs. Underneath the tongs are also the triads, the Chinese mafia. And so, for example, the Fujian American Association is the front for the Fuqing gang, one of the largest transnational organized crime groups in the world. These guys are human traffickers, drug traffickers, smugglers, you name it, they do it. In the 90s, there was that human trafficking incident. It was the Golden Venture. It was a ship that ran aground off the coast of New York. A lot of people, basically died in the freezing water. These groups were also behind the Chinatown bus wars. In the 90s, they were a mess. You had guys shooting up, Chinese restaurants with Uzis and stuff like that. But anyways, I started noticing these tongs were involved. And seeing this, I was like, okay, maybe there is something going on here. And then something even more interesting happened, which is that the Chinese consulate general at the time, Peng Ke-yu, was seen meeting with the heads of these organizations, shaking their hands and congratulating them. And so there you have then an example of not only Tongs involved with direct connections to the Chinese mafia, but also the Chinese consulate general going and congratulating them. And then I started finding different politicians being involved in it, Chinese politicians in the U.S. Started finding different types of community leaders involved in it. And this started painting a very strange picture, one that I couldn't quite understand at first. And what this ended up leading to was my discovery of what's called the United Front. And this is generally, I'd say, better known now. There are a lot of government reports on the United Front. In fact, Pompeo just came out and actually called out the United Front, talking about how this branch of the Chinese, it's a branch of the Chinese government. He talked about how this branch of the Chinese government has databases in all 50 U.S. governors, for example, and how they keep track of that, their stances on China. Mm-hmm. Now, what is the United Front? The United Front is basically how the Chinese Communist Party, it's a branch of the Chinese Communist Party that basically works on creating a front line for the Chinese Communist Party in overseas communities. It's extending the reach of the Chinese Communist Party into foreign countries. And so basically it turns Chinatowns in every part of the world into like mini Chinese provinces. And it works by basically subverting the Tongs. And so they'll work through the Chinese consulates. In fact, the New York Chinese consulate, you can go on their website, at least up to a couple weeks ago. I checked it out, and I actually did a report on it and a video on it. If you were to go on the New York Chinese consulate website, and you'll see that the United Front is listed as one of their missions. And so these guys will go into the Chinatowns, they'll approach the Tong leaders, and they'll try to win over their support. And if they win over their support, they gain control of all the members of that Tong. And these Tongs, I mean, you have business Tongs, you have police Tongs, you have oil worker Tongs, you have, let's say, IT worker Tongs, you name it. If there's an industry, there's a Tong for it. If there's an organization in the U.S., there's a Tong for it. And as soon as they gain control over the Tongs have a kind of favor system. If you're a Tong member and another Tong member needs something, you're obligated to provide them with it. And again, they control both the legitimate and illegitimate sides of the society. So you need to get your cousin a job. You can probably find it through the Tong. Of course, you'll have to give some gifts in exchange for that. Mm-hmm. You want to, get your brother the good word to get into the New York Police Department. They'll have a Tong member pull some strings and do some favors and stuff. If you want to have your cousin smuggled from China, they'll have the snakeheads do it. The Tongs are tied to it. If you want to get into the drug trade, Tongs are tied to it. You need some slaves for your restaurant, Tongs can do it for you too. And so, I mean, that's how the whole system works. And
that is crazy, man. Wait, let's slow down for a second. So obviously the FBI is on this. They're aware of it, and because they're always doing the, counter gang, counter drug, counter racketeering stuff.
No, dude, it's so bad. It's so bad. You have no idea. Now, I thought the same thing. I was like, okay, hopefully the U.S. government knows about this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm like I'm on the front lines investigating this stuff. People are like full on threatening to kill me, like on a weekly basis, right? Mm. And like walking up to me and saying, we're going to kill you, right?
Yeah.
And like surrounding me and stuff. But, it was crazy. But
But do you take these threats credibly? I mean, are these things you're worried about?
They haven't threatened me in like a good 10 years or so now.
Mm-hmm.
So, whatever. But back then it was pretty dicey.
Mm-hmm.
I had a contact who was a house Christian and a democracy activist. They told him they hired a hitman to chop off one of his hands. And they slashed his tires of his car because he was going to be holding an event later that day about some of this stuff. And, it was complicated. What I did was I wrote a story on it, and I said, okay, if they chop your hand off, everyone's going to know who did it. So
yeah, wow.
But and they didn't do it, so it was okay in the end. But it was pretty dicey, man.
Yeah, it sounds dicey, and I want to get into that, but I really want to
transition into this corona stuff because it's so topical. I know you guys are working on a big project yourselves. Given what we understand now about the tongs and how the Chinese government and the Chinese communities work to create this influence and everything, we have this problem with the Wuhan virus, COVID-19, whatever we want to call the coronavirus. But what do you know to date? And right now it's the middle of March. What do you know to date as far as the origins and all of those kind of things?
Well, so here's the big point. We're finishing up as we speak a investigative documentary looking into the origins of the coronavirus, and we're going to be publishing it pretty soon. I think when this airs, it'll either be published or be just about to be published. And here's the biggest point. The Chinese Communist Party lied to the West multiple times about the origin of the virus, about how it was transmitted, about the dangers of the virus, about numbers in the virus. I mean, you name it, they've lied about it. Somehow the West is just satisfied with being lied to. And if you start looking into, okay, what was the origin? What were the intermediary species? What are the real numbers? Then the WHO and different organizations come out and call you a conspiracy theorist. It's bizarre. Basic information you need when dealing with a pandemic, the most basic piece of information is what is the origin and how did it become human transmittable? And the Chinese Communist Party originally said the origin was this Wuhan seafood market. That has been proven to be a lie. That was an absolute lie. And
is it a lie or is it the fog of war and they're giving you the best information at the time?
It's like 99% a lie, let's put it that way. The patient zero, the very first known case, December 1st, had no known connection whatsoever with the Wuhan market.
Wow.
No connection.
Yeah.
30% of the cases afterwards had no known connection. Not only that, but the Chinese Communist Party after that made a criteria for diagnosis that you had to have had contact with the Wuhan market as part of the criteria of being diagnosed with the virus. And so they changed the criteria to say you would have had to have had contact with the market. They lied to the West about that. Number two, you need to know what the intermediary species is. Let's suspend disbelief for a minute. Let's say, okay, maybe it was and real quick too, they also said it came from bats. There were no bats at that marketplace. That viral video going around wasn't even from Wuhan, or that viral image going around of that woman eating that bat soup wasn't even from Wuhan. I mean, there were no bats. They hibernate this time of year. The whole thing is just, it doesn't line up. But let's suspend disbelief for a minute. So let's pretend that, patient zero did have connection to that, which they didn't. Let's pretend they did. Now, what happened? The Chinese Communist Party said it came from that marketplace. What do? They go in there and they just get rid of the entire crime scene. They clean the entire thing out. They get rid of all the evidence. Now, imagine this was a murder scene. They go in there, they get rid of the body, they clean up all the blood, they get rid of the bullet casings, and they say, okay, time for the investigators to come in and figure out how this murder happened. Right? That's what they did. That's what they did. And then even worse than that, when they do testing to figure out where the virus came from, instead of going and directly testing, saying, okay, what were the intermediary species? What were the animals? They went and tested the surfaces to find evidence of the virus. And they said, okay, there's particulates, whatever you want to call it, of the virus on some of the booths and stuff, rather than testing the animals. Mm-hmm. That's like saying if there was people are getting sick from a restaurant, and instead of going and testing the food, you go and swab the tables.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's what they did, right? That's what they did. And then they come out into the West and they say, okay, the intermediary after they start getting pressure, what the intermediary species was, they say, oh, it was the pangolin. Now, the pangolin being this Chinese armadillo looking thing that they don't really have in many other places, which means, for the West, it's not much of a concern. Mm-hmm. But not long after, Nature comes out, journal Nature, and shows that basically the science doesn't line up. They lied again. They messed with the numbers. They messed with the data. It's a lie again. And so, okay, so the origin story is fake. The intermediary species thing is fake. The testing of the surfaces is done in really bizarre ways that suggest that they're not really even testing to find out where it came from. The cleanup was done sloppily. Had there actually been anything there, I mean, pretty much any chance of investigating how it came about is gone, wiped out. And so the West now, instead of, I think, more deeply pursuing, well, okay, what was the origin then? Where did it actually come from then? They're just satisfied with saying, okay, China's not going to tell us. We're okay with that. And anyone who tries to look into it, well, you're a conspiracy theorist. Sorry, folks. Right. But here's a few interesting things. Now, I don't really care what they try to say. So let's dig into the real data on this. Right. Now, if you go into the virus sequence, now there's a couple things interesting with the virus sequence. In the early days of this virus spreading, Chinese scientists were submitting publicly, data on the virus itself, the sequence. China later shut that down, which means that the West is no longer able to track mutations in the virus, which is, we need that. And so basic information that we need in order to, one, deal with, where did this come from, in order to prevent further spread of the virus, in order to try to figure out how it's mutating, in order to figure out what its current forms are. China has not only not given that to us, but they've either gotten rid of it, they've lied about it, or they've covered it up. And it's crazy. Not to mention all the numbers they've covered up. But that aside, let's look at the sequence. Now, what is unique about this virus? The shell of the virus. I forget the technical term for it. Now, what's interesting is it has so the virus sequence has a match in this data bank of viruses. Of course, the scientific community has these virus data banks. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the virus envelope has a 100% match to a Zhoushan bat, right? Mm-hmm. Now, that's one of the proteins. The other one has, I think, something like an 88% match, close. Now, what's interesting about this Zhoushan bat, which is what this virus is closest to, is that, in other words, a 100% match on the envelope, is that virus was submitted to the data bank by the Chinese military.
Okay.
Now, how is it that the Chinese military submits a virus that's a 100% match to this virus, and nobody's talking about that?
Right.
The other part is, right, but so the envelope itself is like the bat coronavirus. The other issue is, okay, how did this bat coronavirus become human transmittable? Now, the human transmittable part comes from the spikes, which are those little, protruding mushroom-looking things coming off it. You've all seen those pictures by now. Now, those little mushroom thingies have a 70% gene match to SARS.
Oh, okay.
And so so get this. Now, how did a bat coronavirus submitted to this data bank by the Chinese military magically merge with SARS to create this new bat coronavirus spreading all over China and now all over the world? Mm-hmm. Right? How did that happen?
Yeah.
Now, to even have the 100% match of this Zhoushan bat, at least from experts I've interviewed, suggests that this was not a mutation. This was a recombination. It would be very difficult for this to happen naturally, especially given the type of virus it is. But what's more interesting is, now everyone's heard about this P4 laboratory about 20 miles up the street from that, with that Wuhan seafood market, where everyone's talking about being the, alleged, well, say, originally said was the, origin of it, but later proven false. What's interesting about that P4 lab 20 miles up the road is that in 2015, the head of that lab submitted a paper and even published it all over China, bragging that they had altered a bat coronavirus to become human transmittable.
Wait a second. Hold on. What? Can you say that again?
Yeah. 2015, the head of that lab published a paper saying they had altered a bat coronavirus to become human transmittable.
Wow.
Yeah, right? Yeah. And of course, that lab has had issues too. They've had leaks in the past. There's been issues with it. And what's even more interesting
why is it that I got to ask, man, because why isn't someone like 60 Minutes or CBS or, some other legitimate news thing, why aren't they on this? How can this be that nobody else is on this story like that?
Dude, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it blows my mind too, to be honest. This is what I get with some journalists these days. There's the narrative, right? There's the established narrative that if you go against it, everyone's going to get together and attack you. Right now, anyone who talks about that P4 lab is getting called a conspiracy theorist. Anyone who talks about the possibility of a bioweapon is getting called a conspiracy theorist.
Right.
The WHO is just parroting whatever the Chinese Communist Party says right now. It's bizarre and it's sickening. And I think it calls into serious questions with the legitimacy and credibility of the WHO, just being very blunt. Of course, China has a lot of influence at the United Nations, including with the Human Rights Division, which I've written about before.
Right.
I mean, it's crazy. I mean, just to illustrate this, we actually had one of our other investigative reporters at Epoch Times. He's a freelancer, Alex Newman. He wrote a story just recently exposing something that happened with the UN Human Rights Division, where these defectors in China and whistleblowers coming out wanted to talk about abuses in China. The WHO took all their names and provided them to the Chinese Communist Party.
Wow.
Every one of them was prevented from getting out of China. Some of them had their families arrested. Almost all of them were arrested, and at least one of them died in prison because the WHO submitted their names to the Chinese Communist Party. And then not only that, but the whistleblower at the United Nations was punished by the United Nations for this, for calling them out. I mean, just to illustrate the influence China has at the United Nations. And so the WHO coming out and saying, okay, everyone, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain when it comes to this. I mean, take it with a grain of salt as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. But as far as I'm concerned, is also a lot of media are just playing along with what they're saying.
But why would they do that? I mean, this is a story that, I mean, look, I get the whole thing of sowing fear because that sells ads and all that kind of thing. But why not just tell this story straight up and down and then, investigate and report upon what you find as an what does China have over everybody else? I mean, access to goods? We can get that from somewhere else. Hey, this is P.A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here. And if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it. What does China have over everybody else? I mean, access to goods? We can get that from somewhere else.
It's hard to say. I could give my 2 cents on it.
Please do.
I mean, if you look at, for example, China Daily. Now, what's interesting recently is that China Daily being one of the main state-run publications of China's Communist Party. Okay. The U.S. State Department recently designated China Daily and 4 other Chinese state-run media as foreign missions of the Chinese Communist Party, it goes beyond the designation of just FARA, which would be the Foreign Agents Registration Act. This means that they are like diplomatic missions of the Chinese Communist Party itself, not just agents, but actual missions of the country. Okay. Now, what's interesting is, given their ties and how they work as basically just branches of the government. Now, what's interesting is that China Daily, there were, I think, 35 Republican politicians came out, wrote a joint report calling for an investigation into it because they say it's been violating FARA, because it was under FARA before this, by not providing information on U.S. publications it has been placing paid advertisements in, which are under its China Watch inserts, which are running in 30 different U.S. publications, among them New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, you name it. News outlets have been taking money from the Chinese Communist Party under what is now registered as a foreign mission of the Chinese Communist Party in violation of FARA to publish state-run propaganda directly in their publications under China Watch. And I mean, that's just the publications themselves. You want to get to deeper levels, you're talking about academics getting subverted, you're talking about think tanks getting subverted, you're talking about, you talk about parent companies of these media. I mean, you get to the high levels of it. I think 6 corporations control just about all the media in the U.S. I mean, it's insane. And then how many of those parent corporations have big, huge business ties with China?
Right.
Cisco, Comcast, Disney. I mean, you name it. They're all working with China really deeply. Bloomberg. I mean, I don't know if anyone remembers the history of Bloomberg in China. That was one of the more serious ones, I'd say. That was when I think it was. So long story short, around 2008, China made this huge propaganda push into the U.S. That was right ahead of the Beijing Olympics, 2008. That was when they took over Times Square. You had Xinhua News on the whole, front and center Times Square all over the place. They launched China Daily in the U.S. They had this huge propaganda push. People were panicking. If you remember, The Onion even did like a joke publication where they pretended that China bought them, and it was pretty funny. It was pretty well done, actually.
Yeah, that is pretty funny.
It was a big thing, right? It was a big thing. But what happened? So long story short, certain news outlets started calling out China and started getting punished for it. It became scandals every time this happened. Bloomberg was one of them. Bloomberg, they had some reporters who did an article that was critical of the Chinese Communist Party. China threatened to pull all the Bloomberg terminals out of China, the Bloomberg financial terminals. And then Bloomberg News came out and said, we will no longer report negatively on the Chinese Communist Party. And so you've had a lot of media, one, because of their own business interests, two, because they're afraid of their journalists losing their visas and being unable to report in China, that have chosen to either report just 50-50, whatever the Chinese Communist Party says, true or false, or two, just not criticize the Chinese Communist Party almost at all. And, except for on some select issues.
Well, that begs the question, why does Epoch Times choose to do this? Why do they endanger their business model, their livelihood, by going after China so rigorously?
We have done it with severe self-sacrifice. I mean, we are as blacklisted as you can possibly get in China. You know what I mean? The Chinese Communist Party does not like us. We have some Chinese expatriate staff whose families get threatened back in China, who get phone calls saying, for example, one of our staff members, his family actually got told by police to come invite him to go visit China. His family told him, never come back. They're trying to get you, basically.
Wow.
Even non-Chinese like myself have been threatened. I mean, it's insane. This is just the price. This is the price of reporting honestly on the Chinese Communist Party, of not being afraid of standing up to them.
Okay, so
if we get advertisers, for example, big companies, we've had reports of them getting phone calls from the Chinese consulate saying drop our ads, or it's going to affect their business in China. We've had reports of this.
Yeah.
Well,
so let's get back into the Corona thing. Then you were talking about the lab, and I think this is a good transition. And how, if you guys report anything about this lab at all, that you're on the conspiracy theory side. And I want to do some insulation here, but then I want to peel some of that back and poke you a little bit. But when this thing first hits, heck, my friend Kat Connor, my friend Scott Shipman, a new virus, undiscovered or unaccounted for. How does that happen? And don't you instantly, especially you as a reporter, go, what lab was this at? Who screwed up?
Yeah,
I mean, that's a viable question. And then when you start to, pull the thread, you find out that it's not connected to the Wuhan market. It does have these ties potentially to SARS. You start to run out of these, benign, origins, some lady eating a bat or whatever it is. And all of a sudden you get into the problem of these things. So talk about the lab a little more and give us a little context on what that means. Because there's a lot of folks that maybe have heard about it, but there's plenty that haven't, because it's just not reported on accurately. And then just kind of go from there, and we'll take it from there.
Right. So 2002, 2003, China had an outbreak of the SARS virus. Now, there was also a cover-up of the SARS virus that took place in China. A lot of the numbers were not accurate. Epoch Times actually broke the story on that back in 2002, 2003. Shortly afterwards, China said that they need to have a virus research facility capable of studying viruses like that. And so around 2003, 2004, they partnered with France to create the first P4 lab in China. Now, there's been a lot of issues with that lab. There was, of course, a lot of concerns, published concerns that, viruses could leak out and infect Wuhan. And Wuhan being the main transit hub of all of China. Like if you go between the north and south, you have to go through Wuhan. It's where like the Chinese Communist Party has all its major conferences. It's the hub. It's where everything spreads from Wuhan. I mean, literally and just hypothetically, everything spreads from Wuhan. And so a virus spreading in Wuhan was unthinkable. It's like the worst place you could have an outbreak. And so why were they building it in Wuhan? That was the big concern. They ended up building this lab. France, I think, allegedly pulled out of it. They alleged that there were allegations that China had basically taken the plans after France helped to design the lab. And China was building like additional facilities and things like this. There were a lot of allegations. Pretty much a lot of China experts I know believe that basically China used France to design this advanced, research lab for them and took the plans and just built it themselves because they needed a country that had the capabilities to build a lab like that to figure out how to do it. If you're dealing with the Chinese Communist Party, they call that having a sparring partner. When you invite businesses to China to say, start their own thing, they call you a sparring partner. They're going to let you stay there just as long as they need in order to copy what you're doing. And as soon as they can replace you, they're going to kick you out. They did the same thing with this P4 lab, right?
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of other stuff we can go into. On the Chinese military side, of course, they were talking about bioweapons real heavily around that time too. And I know people are like, oh man, don't talk about bioweapons. It's a conspiracy theory, whatever. But look, the head of the Chinese military in like 2003-ish came out and talked about the need for China to develop bioweapons because nuclear weapons are no longer viable. Attacks with nuclear weapons are mutually assured destruction. This is what he said.
Right.
Attacks with nuclear weapons are mutually assured destruction. They are not usable in a military sense. And so what he said was we need to develop bioweapons because you can release 12 different bioweapons in a country, wipe them out, they'll never know who did it.
Right. It's
easy to do. It's easy, right? And so they were talking about this. The head of the Chinese military was talking about that, right?
Yeah.
If in fact, even up until like 2015, they were talking about this. I think latest 2017, I've seen reports on this. Some of their main military doctrine talks about bioweapons. And yes, they're signatories of the 1984, they signed on to the Biological Weapons Agreement. But even according to the State Department, as late as last year, had a report talking about how China, even though it signed that agreement, never showed signs of getting rid of the programs that we even knew they had going back to 1950. Never even acknowledged that they had programs that we knew for a fact they had. So no evidence they've ever gotten rid of anything, no evidence they've ever changed anything. It even said in that report last year that a lot of their programs appear to be dual use. In other words, they could be used for medical research, they could be used for biological weapons. And at the same time, I mean, being fair, just about every country in the world has biological weapons programs. Let's just be honest with ourselves. It's just, they're not called weapons programs. They're called defensive programs. So you can research biological weapons as a defensive measure and not call it an offensive system.
Sure, that makes sense.
It's considered okay. You know what I mean? And so every country does it. Every major country does it.
So they. Yeah. I mean, like anybody else, the nation is always trying to protect itself, improve its position. China has a huge problem with their middle class is erupting, and those folks want TV and refrigerators and medicine. So, a lot of what China has to do is provision those things to stay viable. And we want a stable China. I mean, in the world, like for sure, we don't want them going crazy. But we also know that they steal intellectual capital. They pirate things. They are terrible on human rights, all these other things. And so I think, to look at this problem with China and how we contain their outbreak in a way that is beneficial to them and not harmful to the rest of the world. Do you want to get on a rocket going to the moon that's made in China or Germany? Let's go on the German rocket.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I don't think it's at all a stretch. And then there's so much of this. China is so big and so pervasive. They really can attack these things in a variety of ways. Do you think, is your sense that this is just a unfortunate group of circumstances that Corona breaks out, and China's not going to do that? You know, we know from Chernobyl, anybody watch this series, and how much, you know, Russia worked to hide the truth, even though they understood the worldwide impact. Is this just a thing that happened that was a bad, you know, like somebody screwed something up protocol wise, and now we're dealing with this, and they're not going to ever admit to it, or is this a purposeful, you know, draft attack on their own people, or looking at the pandemic process or something? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, let me explain this on a couple levels. I think there's a couple points first on this lab people should understand. Now, look, a lot of Chinese agents, a lot of these guys, they think Americans are stupid. That's just how they regard us. They think we're stupid. They know that if they smile and tell us anything in a nice enough way, we're going to believe them. And so they can be like, oh, you know, you racist Americans saying China, you know, made bioweapons. How dare you? You're so racist. You know, you're offensive. You should publish apologies in your newspaper. And a lot of newspapers just do that, right? Mm-hmm. In fact, if you read the way a lot of their defensive stuff is just calling people racist, because they know that's our weak point.
Okay.
They have a saying, which is, it's strangle you with your own system. They study the weak points of your culture and your society, and they just use it against you. They have groups like the Committee of 100, which operates openly in the U.S. that does stuff like this. I mean, it's sick. It's sick. A lot of their stuff, it's overt espionage. It doesn't even violate U.S. law. They're allowed to operate on U.S. soil. Right. When it comes to their internal stuff, I mean, they're so open about it that it's crazy that Western journalists aren't catching on to it. Xi Jinping came out, I mean, just a few weeks ago and said publicly, when talking about the coronavirus, he comes out and he says, we need to make lab biosafety a national security priority. Why does he say, when talking about the coronavirus, making lab safety a national security issue? Right? Like, why did he say that? That had nothing to do with the lab. The head of the Chinese Communist Party comes out and says that. In addition to that, in China, they're no longer even denying it. They're no longer even denying it didn't come from a lab. They're not even denying it anymore. Wow. You know what the narrative in China is right now?
What?
They're saying it was an American bioweapon used against China. That's the narrative being spread in China.
That's
right
like
now.
Straight out of the propaganda playbook too, and I'm not making that up. Like when you go to create mis or disinformation, you deny. At some point, you're going to mitigate, but you absolutely try to push it on somebody else. Like it's straight out of the playbook. Yeah,
I mean, so in China now, the narrative is this was lab made and it was a bioweapon. That's just the narrative now. They're no longer trying to say otherwise. In the West, I mean, I don't even know where people are at when thinking about this. Mm-hmm. It's just this, you know, you're racist if you call it the Wuhan virus. You know, that's the narrative right now, right?
Right.
But yeah, in terms of how it got out, I mean, personally, I think when it comes to the lab, of course, we can't say without a doubt it came from the lab. I would say based on the evidence, it is the most plausible. It is the most plausible scenario. You know, if you walk into your house, you know, at one afternoon and there's a glass of water sitting on your table and you didn't pour it yourself, you assume based on logical reasoning that someone poured a glass of water and put it on your table, that it did not magically pour itself and through some miracle of, you know, I don't know, universal properties managed to, you know, pour itself and put it on the table. You assume the most logical way it got there. Someone poured it and put it on the table.
Right.
This virus is the same way. The most logical way you could possibly understand it based on all the research, based on all the data, is that it came from a lab. That's just the most logical thing.
Yeah.
Right? Based on all the information. Yeah, but how did it get out? Well, first off, made in China. It's a lab. I mean, honestly, it could have gotten out. There have been other virus escapes from Chinese labs in China. In fact, there was one, I think, in Xinjiang province where the Muslim Uyghurs are that got out of a lab. They've had SARS escape at least a couple times now. It's not unheard of for viruses to escape from Chinese labs. This has happened. Mm-hmm. And even if we're not talking about China, I mean, other countries, they have stuff like this happen. It's not unheard of. It's not let's say I don't even want to say it's not rare because it happens every few years,
Right.
but it happens. Let's put it that way. At the same time,
Why is China so, at least from my perception, why are they so bad at this stuff?
it's a communist system. I mean, what's the incentive, and how do you move up in a communist system, right? Like,
Right.
I mean, what's the incentive to do well? People don't care. It's just, there's no incentive to do well. That's basically it.
Well, and again, you go right back to the whole Chernobyl thing, and it's just, you see what happens when the accountability is top down. You can't fail up. Like it has to be something else. You're always worried about the narrative and about the nation before the actual incident. It's
but I'm actually on that point though. Just one other point. There is a possibility that it was done intentionally, but this is where things get real crazy. All right, so bear with me. Long story short, there are two different political factions that have been kind of fighting for control in China at the Communist Party level. I mean, there are a lot of different factions in China. There are a lot of different groups that have major influence over the system. But when you get to the real kind of top level battle, it's between two factions. One is the Xi faction, Xi Jinping's faction, the current one in power. The other one is the Jiang faction, Jiang Zemin, who was 2 leaders ago. There was Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping, current guy. Hu Jintao aligned with Xi Jinping. Jiang Zemin, basically during Hu Jintao's reign, still basically ran the country. Complicated stuff, right? Now, Xi launched this whole anti-corruption campaign. I won't get into the whole thing because it's like Game of Thrones crazy, right? I mean, crazy stuff. Guys, trying to kill each other, you name it. Game of Thrones crazy when you get into the stuff. Xi Jinping launched his anti-corruption campaign, allegedly to get rid of corruption. Almost all the guys he targeted were Jiang Zemin guys. Basically, Jiang Zemin had created this whole pay-to-play system throughout the entire Chinese Communist Party. Not saying it was free of corruption before or is free of corruption now in any way, but, of course, those guys were all pretty dang corrupt anyways. Basically, Xi Jinping now mostly controls the Chinese military. One thing he does not currently control are the Chinese laboratories. And so the head of that Wuhan lab is very close to Jiang Zemin's brother. And there are some China analysts who believe that Jiang Zemin might have had something to do with this leak because it was very well timed. I mean, if this faction is being cornered, in which they are right now, and they're risking collapse, which they are right now, I mean, it is not in any way beyond them to do something desperate. And I mean, this was the faction that started the persecution of Falun Gong. This is the faction that started pretty much a genocide against 100 million people. Torture, re-education through labor, live organ harvesting, you name it. That's the faction that did it. Killing 1,000 people is nothing to them. I mean, killing 1 million people is nothing to them. And so, releasing a virus at the worst possible time for the Xi faction, I would expect them to do it. Let's put it that way. I wouldn't even say I wouldn't put it beyond them. I would be surprised if they didn't do something like this if they had the opportunity. And the timing of it was perfect.
Well, let me just say this too. From working abroad in a lot of places like Iraq, we were trying to figure out why these guys kept getting targeted and blown up, right, coming up into the elections and everything. And these weren't people that we had in our radar. And one of the days they blew up the guy's house, but not him or his family. And I'm asking the general, and I'm like, what do you make of this? And he just smokes on a cigarette. It is politics. If they wanted him dead, he would be dead. They just want him to not run for office anymore. It is politics. I'm like, oh, okay, you guys play hardball around here.
How considerate? Yeah, how considerate? Yeah, they gave him a chance
we like
to
you,
make a choice.
but we don't like you that much.
Yeah.
But I think that you're right. Like when you look at these things, we're terrified to report on it. It's very hard to get reliable reporting. I'm assuming a lot of your sources are in country to get that reliably out, that information. It's the same thing like when we look at Iran. And you get and more, this is becoming possible because Iran is being cracked open from the inside out and by technology from the outside in. You can see the videos and the reporting, and it matches up, across disparate people. And you're like, they are telling the truth. The government is not. So when we look at something like the coronavirus, the COVID-19, the Wuhan market virus, whatever we want to call it, I think until we have a real idea on what the narrative is, we have to at least make possible still that this thing broke out of a weapons facility and quite likely was let to expand based to improve someone's political position. I don't think that's a conspiracy theory. I think that with what we know so far and how the Chinese treat one another and the rest of the world, I think it's a viable thing.
Well, I've talked about this before. I think one issue Americans, well, not just Americans, a lot of Westerners in general, we have when trying to understand things like the Chinese Communist Party is we're too nice.
Yeah.
It's not conceivable to us that a government would do things like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
It's just too much. Mm-hmm. It's almost like we can't. You want to have a real solid reasoning behind things that would justify something as crazy as that. Where for some of these people, I mean, they'll do terrible things for very, very minor pieces of self-interest. I mean, it can be things that seem very minor to us, and they'll do drastic, horrible things to protect that little bit of self-interest for themselves. I mean, there are people who don't think like us in the world, and it's a hard realization to come to when you start dealing with stuff like this.
So when does the piece come out, and where can we find it, and how do we get more of what you're doing?
The documentary is not set in stone. It'll be out next week sometime. You can check the Epoch Times homepage website, TheEpochTimes.com. You can also check me out on Twitter. I'll have it posted there. And that's at Josh J. Philipp, Philipp.
Yeah, and definitely I'll put all that stuff in the show notes so you guys can find it. It's interesting talking to you, Josh, and I want to have you come back and talk about China some more because it's just such a big...
Oh, dude, I went through the same process. Don't you know?
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't believe half this stuff when I first came across it. I was like, this is too crazy, man. But I think this is actually why a lot of journalists can't cover it. They can't conceive of the insanity. They want a very easy to understand, digestible picture, right? Mm-hmm. If you start dealing with, United Front and faction battles and crazy, crazy Chinese generals, and I mean, it's a lot to take on, man.
Yeah, it is actually a lot to take on, and I'm giving you the professional courtesy of not, cite your sources because I know you've got them. I've met you, it was great meeting you and hanging out with Peter Van Buren and talking about this thing. But just like the threads that you're pulling together, like the patient zero has no connection to the Wuhan market. Well, there's a big problem right there, and then absolutely.
Yeah, that was actually that was a Western scientific report actually validated that. They tested, I think, 41 or 42 different went over 42, I think, cases. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, and these things matter. These facts matter, and I'm glad you're out there doing that. And I appreciate also, by the way, that the Epoch Times is focused on journalism and investigative reporting, and they don't endorse candidates because, is there anything more pandering than that? I appreciate what you guys are building and how you guys get after it. And I'll be damned. It looks like you guys really have a fantastic means for reporting the Chinese story, and I got to thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you.